Donald Trump says that fairly soon, the United States is going to be providing the Ukrainians with precision targeting information for the Russian energy system deep within the Russian Federation. The U.S. administration, not just this one, all of them going back at least until the 70s, have always been a little paranoid about energy prices. Energy demand tends to be inelastic. If you need a gallon of gas to get to work, and the price of gas goes up by 100%, you still need a gallon of gas to get to work. It tends to be something that is very politically sensitive. Presidents are unwilling to do things that they know are going to drive up energy prices. That relationship has loosened quite a bit in the last 20 years, largely because of the Shale Revolution in the United States, which has taken the United States from the world's largest oil importer to the world's largest oil exporter. Back during the Biden administration, the Ukrainians started targeting Russian energy assets, most notably refineries, in an attempt to disrupt gasoline and diesel deliveries. And the idea was, if we can stop fuel flows, the Russians will be able to prosecute the war as much. In addition, the Russians don't have a lot of storage. So if they can't process fuel, they have limited export capacity. And that means that they will have to shut in some production. The Biden administration shut that down because they were afraid of the impact that it was going to have on global energy prices, which is not a ridiculous point of view, but I still think it was wrong because the shale revolution has changed the math. Enter the Trump administration. The Trump administration has been very erratic. In the early days, they were pathologically hostile to the Ukrainian government.
I can tell you the other side isn't exactly in love with him either.
The path to peace and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy.
We had conversations with him, a lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him, me, like a president. In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed with him with gas contract, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media.
Trump, as part of his re-election campaign, convinced everybody that he and Putin were best bros, and all it would take was one conversation between Trump and Putin for the war to end, which of course was always really incredibly stupid because the war is happening for geopolitical reasons. The Russians have been pushing towards the Carpathians since the 17th century. It didn't change because of who's in the White House. The Russians have gone out of their way to denigrate the American president, to make fun of him, to call him stupid. But that information, as a rule, doesn't make it back to Donald Trump. Will this time be different? Because we've had lots of periods where Trump has got an inkling that something is wrong, and then Tulsi Gabbard has talked him down, or Putin has talked him down. Maybe. And the reason is because there's another personality involved, and this person is absent. His name is Steve Witkoff.
We agreed to robust security guarantees that I would describe as game-changing.
If you remember back to Trump 1, Jared Kushner was all the big deal. Smart guy, basically served as a presidential envoy and actually got a few things done. For example, the Abraham Accords. Kushner wanted nothing to do with Trump 2. You saw how the sausage was made from the inside in Trump 1. Witkoff has no foreign policy experience, and Trump basically entrusted him with the entire portfolio for all negotiations all over the world, all of which have gone really badly. So when Witkoff shows up at the Kremlin, the Russians sit him down, they tilt his head back, and they pour gallons of Russian propaganda down his throat. He goes back to the White House and vomits that up, but things have changed recently because a couple months ago there was a summit directly between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and it was supposed to last for several hours, and it was over very, very quickly. Putin thought he had Trump completely wrapped around his little finger, but Trump finally realized that this guy had been laughing at him for the whole time, and we started to get Trump looking at other bits of information. And he started to realize that he had been played the fool and that he was acting like a fool. We now have this potential change in policy. The Ukrainians have started targeting Russian energy infrastructure again, mostly going after refineries, but going after some pipeline places. And they've probably now reduced Russian refining capacity by 40%. So 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been taken offline, which is the most that's been offline since the Russian collapse back in the 1990s. The post-Soviet collapse. If the Trump administration actually does what it's talking about doing, U.S. satellite guidance combined with the weapons the Ukrainians already have would be capable of targeting individual pumping stations anywhere in Western Russia. And the Russians export about 5 million barrels a day through their various methods, about 2/3 of that going out through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, which are all within range of Ukrainian weapons. If you take out just a couple of the pumping stations, those exports go to zero. If you do that, you basically destroy what has been Russia's #1 income source for the last 30 years, oil exports. And then countries like Iran and China, which have been taking money from Russia and sending them drones and drone parts, will have to decide whether they want to directly subsidize the Russian government's war in Ukraine. Iran is really in some dire straits right now. They need the currency. They don't want to treat Russia as a charity case. And the Chinese, that's probably a bridge too far, no matter how bad relations with the United States happen to be. So if that happens and the Russians have to fight on their own, it doesn't mean that the war is over, but it means you have a catastrophic shift in fortunes on both sides. Will this happen? That's entirely up to Donald Trump. But once the intel is provided, for every day that it is there, the Ukrainians will definitely be striking. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians over the last year have been building up their drone capabilities, and we're now regularly seeing attacks that use hundreds of drones on each side. You combine that with precision targeting information, much less Western weaponry, and you can have a really dramatic change in the course of the war. Now, some of these attacks are more political in mind, the ones that hit places like Moscow, where the political elite lives, or Sochi down in the Black Sea, where the political elite vacations. The Ukrainians are showing that they can hit targets more than 1,000 miles away from their borders, specifically a place called Bashkortostan. It's a province in western Siberia, eastern European Russia, populated by ethnic Bashkiri, who are a Turkic minority, pretty large one in the Russian space. But the fun thing about Bashkortostan is it sits at a pipeline nexus that links pretty much all of the southern Siberian energy fields into the European pipeline network. And so if there's meaningful damage in Bashkortostan, you're not just looking at problems with refining or production, you're talking about upwards of 3 million barrels a day that could get locked in. And the Ukrainians have figured out that going after a pumping station is a really good idea if you want to disable some of the pumping infrastructure. Primorsk is a port on the Gulf of Finland, very close to St. Petersburg. Gulf of Finland is an arm of the Baltic Sea. It is arguably Russia's top export destination, that the Gulf of Finland writ large. Not only is there Primorsk, there's a place called Ust-Luga. Both of them have been hit recently, and both of them now are operating below half effectiveness. So Primorsk used to export about 1 million barrels a day, now it's about half that. Ust-Luga used to be about 700,000 barrels a day, now it's about half that. You put all this together, and the Russians are facing a crisis point in their energy sector that honestly I'm a little surprised it hasn't happened to this point. The Russian energy sector has limited export points that are not well linked together. They've got a single spot out on the Far East that kind of is its own network. And then out on the western side, they've got a few ports on the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and the rest are piped exports that go through Ukraine or Belarus into Europe proper. Those pipelines have now been shut down. That just leaves the maritime ports. And if something happens that would prevent crude from, say, reaching Primorsk, some might be able to go to the Black Sea, but none of it could go out to the Far East. So the Russians are losing flexibility within their system. And now that we've got roughly 750,000 barrels per day of throughput on the Baltic Sea that can't flow, and now that we have 20% of refining offline, all of a sudden there's somewhere in the vicinity of about 2 million barrels a day of crude produced that can't go anywhere. And like the American system, where there's massive tank farms in every major city, the Russians don't have that. They're used to producing crude, sending it to refineries, having it turned into fuel and consumed locally or exported, and the rest goes to an export point and is exported.